Hi everybody, my name is William Worley, and today we're going to be talking about how individuals with autism take things more literal than others, and this is more commonly referred to as being a black and white thinker. Now, what is a black and white thinker? That's when someone looks at two situations that are complete opposites of each other and jump to absolute conclusions without understanding the full context of the situation. For instance, people who are not right are wrong. People who are not nice are mean. People who don't succeed are failures. Or people who are not rich are poor. See, a lot of situations have what is referred to as gray in them, meaning that there is something behind those two opposites that people fail to see. When you take opposite colors like black and white, you'll see that gray is a blend of the two. When it comes to gray thinking, it means that you are viewing the same thing from different angles and with a different context. Let's say, for instance, you come across a yes and no situation. For example, you ask a girl out for coffee and she says yes. A person can easily come to the conclusion that when she says yes to having coffee, that means she is going to be his wife, when in reality, she said yes to having coffee because she's interested in getting to know you and enjoys going out. Now, what if she says no to having coffee? A person can easily conclude that she said no because she doesn't like him, but that may not even be the case at all. She may have simply said no because it's not the right time, she may have something important going on, or maybe she's just not up to it for whatever reasons that have nothing to do with that person. These are some categories of being a black and white thinker. One is like a difficulty seeing things in full perspective. That can either mean that you are looking at a subject from one angle and jumping to conclusions. You could be looking at a small area of a picture and not viewing the whole picture. You could only be reading a couple words instead of the whole sentence. Another is difficulty understanding nonverbal communication, and that can be having a hard time recognizing facial expressions or cues, recognizing body language, understanding tones of voices. Or number three, you can have a difficult time connecting similar patterns or situations or categories. Four, you're reading too much into things. Five, you have a hard time reading in between the lines. And then six, you have a hard time understanding signs or rules. Now here are a couple examples of how an average person thinks versus how a person with autism thinks. This is a picture of what is called a gradient. A gradient is an implied term of starting from one end and working its way to the other end. You take this picture here in the example, for instance. It starts off at one end as completely black, and then it moves to the right. It slowly turns into completely white. As you can see the progress it is making as it shifts from black to white, you see the black slowly becomes brighter, turning grayer, and eventually getting brighter to the point where it becomes completely white. This is an example of how an average person thinks. In this example here, we have a solid black box and a solid white box lined up next to each other. The black box does not progress from black to white. It just remains in its solid color state and then automatically jumps to a solid white color state. This is an example of how an individual with autism thinks. Let me give you a few examples of how an average person thinks versus how an autistic person thinks. It is said that today 60% of communication is nonverbal. In addition to nonverbal communication, there are a lot of hidden messages that are not instantly recognized, but soon uncovered. This can apply to phrases, sayings, social interactions, particularly eye contact or body language, and then there are unspoken rules. If we go back to our example of the gradient image, which defines how an average person thinks, the average person would have an easier time deciphering hidden messages, unspoken rules, or nonverbal communication, whereas an autistic person would not be able to recognize it at first glance unless he was given the proper feedback or coaching. I'll give you a few examples of nonverbal versus verbal communication. In the movie Speed, When Sandra Bullock steps onto the city transit bus and finds her seat, she has Alan Ruck sitting behind her, and he attempts to hit her up by making small talk with her. There are many ways to tell that she is clearly not interested in him. One, her back is turned to him the whole time he's talking to her. Two, she's been giving one or two worded responses to him without smiling, or looking at him, or sounding enthusiastic. It is also important to realize that she's just on her way to work. She's not looking to be picked up by men, otherwise she could hang out at a bar or a club for that. Now in a situation like that, an average person would have been able to pick up on those signs and know how to proceed from there. An autistic person, on the other hand, would have had a difficult time understanding that she wasn't interested. Now, if I was hitting on Sandra Bullock back in my earlier days when I was not as high functioning as I am now, and she was giving me all those signs indicating she's not interested, it would have been just easier if she had flat out said, "Please leave me alone, I'm not interested." Would I have been offended? Probably, but it's better to know now instead of later. Here's an example of what I mean. In the movie Gray, when Liam Neeson is sitting down in his passenger seat on the plane, he's sitting next to another passenger who is rambling on and on about his day, and Liam is quick to recognize that giving subtle hints like closing his eyes or not acknowledging him isn't enough for the passenger to recognize that he's not interested. So Liam bluntly says, "Hey, I really don't feel like talking, so I'm just going to put my head back." It may have hurt the guy's feelings, but at least he didn't have to waste his time and energy making things worse. Now let's talk about when it comes to recognizing hidden messages. Something that most people struggle with, and that includes average and autistic people, is giving someone the benefit of the doubt, meaning don't assume the worst when you don't fully understand what is going on. Here are a few examples of what I mean. Communicating through text. You know how when you send a text message, your device will let you know if it's been read or not? A lot of people will get paranoid when they see that their message has been read but didn't get a response. And they react to that by thinking, did I say something wrong? Is she ignoring me? Is he in danger? There could be a lot of reasons why the other person didn't respond. Maybe he opened the message and something came up that interrupted him. Maybe he opened the message and he needs time to think of a response. Maybe he's exhausted and doesn't feel like talking. An average person would have had an easier chance of taking those reasons into consideration, whereas a person with autism might not think to consider that and jump to conclusions. Now let's talk about seeing things in full perspective. In this picture, we see a man driving. As you can tell, he can only see what's ahead of him. He can't tell what's going on in his surroundings. Now here's an example. Let's say the driver saw a car speeding down the road and nearly hitting other nearby vehicles. What's a common first thought that pops into people's head? What the... That guy is crazy. What is his problem? Well, how do you know he didn't get a call about a family member dying? Wouldn't you be desperate to be there ASAP? How do you know he wasn't having trouble with his brakes? In this picture here, we have a man looking at footage from different cameras viewed at different locations and angles, so he would have a much better understanding of what's going on than the driver. That's how it is with black and white thinkers versus average gray thinkers. Black and white thinkers tend to look at things from one perspective and jump to conclusions, where gray thinkers try and put things in multiple perspectives and rationalize what could be going on. Now let's talk about difficulty connecting similar situations or patterns or categories. Now what do I mean by this? This means not being fully aware that you're doing the same thing repeatedly. You are aware of your actions, but you fail to realize that it falls into the same category as the previous one. A common factor that we deal with in society is unspoken rules. For example, you see a rule that says no texting and driving. So what do you do next? Let's say you're stopped at a railroad train crossing or at a red light and you text while you're waiting for the train to finish crossing or for the light to turn green. You may not be driving, but it still falls into the same principle of texting and driving. That light could turn green without you realizing it, and you could be keeping a line of cars behind you waiting. Here's another example. Let's say you're at work and you're sitting behind the computer watching YouTube and your boss catches you doing so. The first thing he says is, "You're not supposed to watch YouTube while you're at work, so don't do it again." So you say, "Okay, I apologize. It won't happen again." Now, this time, instead of watching YouTube videos on the computer, you start watching Netflix. You may not be watching YouTube like your boss said not to, but why did he say not to watch YouTube in the first place? You're not being paid to be entertained. You're paid to work. Plus, the company's bandwidth is used for business-related purposes only, not for entertainment. Now, how can we overcome being a black and white thinker? First is to minimize your thinking. People with autism tend to focus on a million things at once, which can overwhelm them and cause them to emotionally explode. Number two, never assume the worst. People with autism tend to be insecure and allow their insecurities to affect their judgment and attitude. Number three, don't presume to know everything about something. People with autism tend to look at a subject and write their own novel about that subject. How can you possibly know everything about that subject? Number four, expand on rules. Is there more to it than what meets the eye? Number five, avoid using unconditional words like never. How do you know you will never achieve something if you don't stop? Number six, challenge your thoughts. Do you have any evidence to support your opinions? Number seven, don't talk in absolutes. It's okay to feel as if something is going on, but that doesn't mean you're right. Well, thank you so much everybody for watching. Please be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more videos.